I'm sure you've all seen videos around revolving around the topic of boxing plus vamp plus insert stand plus spec combo here is OP, and really, it's overpowered. In today's video, I'm going to discuss one of YBA's somewhat unknown problems, but it very much so still exists. The vampire race in YBA is a pretty big problem. And before we go any further, while I was recording this footage, I'm pretty sure a once-in-a-lifetime thing happened to me, so that gets its own video, but anyways, back to the point. To know what we're dealing with, I'm going to describe all the traits and abilities the vampire race has to offer for us. To start, the vampire race turns you into a vampire by using a stone mask, and thus you are given a blood bar. The blood bar is basically a second health bar, so it gives you tons of regen and extra health. Paired with a simple build, it's basically a cheat on how to win, as nobody can ever kill you because of all this extra defense and health you have. Also, the vampire race itself requires no skill points, and since it acts as a race, you can pair specs with it. This is where the main problem resides. Though it comes with a flaw, as you need to have an umbrella as well to revoke the sun, and the vampire race has no immunity to the sun, so it's only really that useful in 1v1 scenarios since the 1v1 arena starts at night. But this is still an issue, even if it doesn't complement 1v1s. Yes, it still has a downside to it, even though you can pair it with certain specs, but we'll touch on that later. And the last thing the vampire race does is buff humanoid damage. The vampire spec also buffs humanoid damage, but in this case you don't really see much of that because when you have the vampire race, you barely ever use your humanoid form, and you're usually using your stand for combat. Basically, if you M1 somebody, it does 5 damage instead of 4. So, paired with boxing, which it's only really compatible with, it buffs all skill damage, which saves you a ton of skill points. So, recapping, vampire race has a blood bar, basically an extra health bar, does not have immunity to the sun, so it still takes sunlight damage if you don't have an umbrella equipped, and also buffs humanoid damage, which once again complements certain specs very well. I don't think this is compatible with Hammond, but everything else is probably compatible. And now, what's wrong with the vampire race and what can we do to fix it? Well, here's the situation. This is the struggle people complain about the least, but it's still very relevant. Let's say you have spec storage, and you want the vampire spec and pluck as separate builds for your stands. For example, you want pluck with Beach Boy in your first slot. Don't ask why I'm doing Beach Boy. Never do Beach Boy pluck, it's awful. And you also have Killer Queen Bites the Dust. Your spec storage consists of pluck and vampire, which you want pluck to go with Beach Boy as a build, while vampire goes with Killer Queen Bites the Dust. Now you want to switch from Killer Queen Bites the Dust Vamp to your Beach Boy Pluck build. But here's the flaw. You still have the vampire race. So, with Beach Boy Pluck, you have to deal with the vampire race along with Pluck, which can be really annoying since Pluck is reliable on the Pluck tool itself, and you take burn damage from the sun, so using Pluck will leave you vulnerable with the vamp race, and you take burn damage. Once again, this is only really present in anything but 1v1 scenarios, but Pluck is still pretty fragile. It's really inconvenient when you want to use something like pluck or boxing normally without the vampire race, but you're forced to use the vampire race if you have vampire in your spec storage. Obviously, you can just reset the vampire race itself, but then you need to get the vampire race back in order for the vampire spec to function properly, let alone work. You can reset the vamp race by talking to Jesus or using a Roka, but if you want to use the vampire spec again, after you reset the vampire race, you have to use a stone mask again. You see why this is a problem? It's super inconsistent and only works for certain things. Not only that, vampire race plus boxing only works in the 1v1 scenario as previously stated, since it starts out at night. So vampire race and boxing is basically useless in other game modes, where the sun is present, as it's very difficult to use spec moves while holding an umbrella, constantly switching back and forth. I still don't know why people aren't talking about this, probably because not many people use vampire, but for those who do, it's probably really annoying to want to use vampire and boxing at different times, but you're just unable to do so because of the vampire race. So, with everything stated, I've made a few solutions. 1. We do nothing at all and keep it in a stupidly inconvenient state and make it hell for people that want to use a different spec, but want to keep vampire as a spec at the same time. 2. Make the vampire race itself a spec and can only be evolved into vampire with the race, and after that, the race is discarded and Vampire functions as a spec. This is personally my preference, but sadly it isn't as logical for the dev team to make. And 3, the one I think we can all agree on, is remove the Vampire race entirely. It doesn't deserve to exist and is a horrible mechanic, making certain specs unplayable or making other specs borderline overpowered. I think the Vampire race should just be removed, but this will most likely never happen, as I'm sure Uzu is very passionate about this mechanic and will never get rid of it. So the only thing we can do is hope that this is removed for the sake of all YBA players. I hope you enjoyed this video, as it's quite different from most things I usually do. But yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.